Hey, how's it going? It's Keith Townsend from the CTO Advisor. It's been a long time since we've had Greg Ferro from the Packet Pushers on one of our platforms. We're recording this as a CTO dose, but I'm pretty sure we recorded it as a podcast because I was too lazy to record one independently last week. And I saw this on my calendar. Hey, Greg, how's it going?
I'm doing really well, Keith. Doing really well. I'm not.
You have your own calendar. What day is this now?
Today is Monday. Today is day 74 of lockdown for me. I've been here in the house, except for very few excursions, to the shops. However, I did go to the shops today and refresh my alcohol supply, and kind of frightened myself with how much I bought. But that's okay. That's my therapy at the moment. Is the alcohol.
The great outputs. There's this Clayton Christensen, I think, is the one who this concept of creative destruction. Out of this COVID-19 lockdown period, we're going to have two great industries born. One, a bunch of babies, and then two, a bunch of alcoholics. I'll fall into one of those two categories. And let me just tell you, we're a little bit too old to have babies now. So
it's exactly what I thought. My children have left home as well. And so I've been taking a little bit of extra time for self-care, I think would be the way to summarize it. And part of that is in the evenings where before I might have skipped having a drink because I've got work the next day, or I'm taking time out, whatever. But now what I'll do is in the evenings, I'll take time to have a couple of drinks instead of none or one, and just relax at the end of the day and try and put it all behind me so that I'm ready for the next day. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about, because I pitched to you about what we wanted to talk about today. And of course, COVID has seen the death of the physical conference. And I was one of the first people to pick out in that it was going to be, we're not going to see a physical event in 2020 at all. And it's hard even to pick out whether there'll be events in 2021. And so you and I started talking about virtual events way earlier, and then you held your CTO Advisor Virtual Conference. And I said to you, I really wanted to sit down and talk to you and debug that, because this COVID-19 and virtual, because I've been a vocal speaking out about not going to conferences, to physical conferences, because it takes so much time and so much energy to get up and go. And I'd much rather see virtual events take off. And I wanted to talk about the successes and the lessons learned from that.
So you're absolutely right. I remember you talking about virtual conferences a couple of years ago, actually. You're all the way on the other side of the pond, and most conferences are U.S. focused. So in our business, which is creating content, we have to kind of go to these things. I see you way too often in conferences versus a pub in the downtown of UK. Like, the worst thing that should happen is that you have to come to London, downtown London, to have, a couple of beers. So let's talk about kind of those two aspects of a virtual event. The first thing that I learned from doing this virtual event is that, one, I can move way faster creating the event. It took me 6 weeks to put from thought to execution. I moved at the speed of the internet. So that was kind of lesson one from the event, is that it was way quicker to plan and execute. And then two, it is a great equalizer. One of the things that I wanted was to have a diverse event. I'm pretty vocal about racial diversity on Twitter. And it's really hard to be diverse when you're asking someone to spend thousands of dollars, or take time off of work, or take time away from their family to fly to San Francisco, or to be intimidated by a bunch of crowd. I mean, I've been in rooms where I'm the only African-American in the entire room. I have this running joke: if you want to find me at a conference, I'm the tall, bald, black guy.
And that's pretty easy to know, because you are the only person.
And so what we wanted to do was, we wanted to be inclusive of having not just racial diversity, but gender diversity. I'm pretty proud to say that 50% of our speakers of the editorial content, the content that I selected, the call for papers, 50% of those speakers were women. And that's not something that we can easily do at physical conferences.
So the inclusiveness gives you two things. First of all, I'm sure it gave you the diversity of people who could present and gave truly equal opportunities for those people to actually turn up. But it also gave them the ability to participate when they wouldn't be able to. So I've been trying to do more and more virtual events, and we actually started organizing at Packet Pushers a couple of years ago with very modest success. I think it's amazing to think that anybody can now get up and speak, but also you were pre-recording some of the presentations. So these people they didn't have to have the stage fright or I could make a mistake and look stupid. They could actually speak up and know that they were in a safe place.
You make a really great point about the pre-recorded piece of it. One of the things that I've learned, I've done a lot of theCUBE, I've done a lot of live content, and I'll spend a couple of minutes or a few seconds talking about the CUBE format in general. The CUBE format works because you're on premises live, and there's an energy and a vibe that comes off the stage with seeing our good friend Stu Miniman up and interviewing Pat Gelsinger or whomever, so people can stop by and see it in real life. There's not many people watching that on the live stream, but at the conference, it creates a great vibe. There's no reason, when you're talking about a virtual event, there's no reason to have the content live. Like you can't read the audience, you can't react when questions come in. We've done webinars long enough to know that, what they do, they throw these canned questions in that are questions from the audience that aren't real questions. So
you
what
write
we
them
do
yourself most of the time.
You write them. Yes, you write them yourself
to generate us. And if there are no questions, I think the first thing is that pre-recorded presentations are better because people can prepare. They can make mistakes. You can re-record something if they goose it, and that's better for the audience, right? And it doesn't. The second thing is that people who would not otherwise be like that, getting up on stage is a very scary, emotional, mental thing. Like I can remember the few times I got up on stage, and it was in a small room at the back of a conference, and there was like 30 to 50 people, and the fear that I had of being, and then later on I can remember standing up on stage in front of a keynoting at 4,000 to 5,000 people and thinking it's not any different to that first time, but it's the same thing. But it makes much more sense if you're trying to reach an audience to not be coming up. Like one of the things that you see so much at conferences is people just getting up and coming off the cuff, unprepped. And so you get bad speech patterns, you get unprepared responses, you get, panels as a way of filling the hours at a conference. And it's just a bunch of experts reacting to each other. Not even as organized as a podcast, because podcasts are very heavily, our podcasts are heavily planned. We structure the format, we have the questions, we have a flow, we have a story arc prepared. I think the potential for virtual conferences to outperform physical conferences is substantial if you consider it from that angle.
Yeah, I think I attended the Red Hat conference, and they had a day zero event, and it was 7,000 people at peak. 7,000 people at a Red Hat Day Zero conference. No slight to Red Hat, but Red Hat is no, AWS, etc. And you enter I think you engage a completely new audience. And so I wanted to ask you a couple of questions around this audience. Do you think the audience for virtual events is necessarily the same audience for in-person events?
I think there's an overlap. I don't think you can say, you can't be absolute. It's a spectrum. So some of the people attending would be the same people who would be at physical events would also be. But for the first time, there's a lot of people who go to physical events who actually don't attend. So for physical events, a lot of the time we send the junior people along and we say, if you do really well this year, you can have a free you'll have a free trip to a vendor's conference. And it's meant to be a reward and a bit of a party and a bit of a good time. And because it's a conference, you can write it off as a tax deduction, as a training thing. So I wouldn't actually make the point that a lot of people who attend conferences physically are actually all that engaged. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're there to sit in sessions and to learn and absorb and train. But there's also a fairly large group of people there who are there just to have a break away from work because job well done. Here's a little like mini break, a little reward for being great, right? And I think for virtual audiences, you're also seeing, and one of the things I've seen with some events is, because I've been forcing myself to attend as many virtual events as possible, partly because I can attend them for the first time ever. I don't have to get on a plane. I don't have to go to the airport. I don't have to get to the other side. I don't have to go through jet lag. I don't have to spend 2 days. So if I go to a 2-day conference, I lose 6 days. I lose 2 days to get there and to be prepared. I lose 2 days coming home to jet lag and so forth. So, you know, just for 2 days worth of physical face-to-face is 6 days of worst loss. Like not just work days, but personal days. Like I lose all my social life, all that, right? So
yeah, so there's a unique value for you and I. I've only gone to a couple of conferences in Europe, but in general, I'm not going to a conference to attend the session. That's not the value for me. The value for me is that, you know what, I get to spend an hour with Greg Ferro in person, and we can either create some content together, we can do some BD, etc., because that's a unique time to be able to do that. The conference is just an excuse, and we have shared clients at a conference, so there's value for us attending that. Matter of fact, most people who attend their first conferences, I tell them, you know what, don't bother with the sessions. They'll be recorded unless there's just something you want to ask a speaker, then you attend that session. But for the rest of it, spend the time reaching out to the Greg Ferros, the Ethan Banks, and the Chris Walls of the world. Go and meet those people, search them out. They're very approachable, and this is a chance to really network. So that piece is missing.
Well, it's not missing because now we're doing it over Zoom. Like you and I today are recording, and we're spending time face to face. So what we're doing is we're substituting what we used to do in person by actually reaching out to each other over Twitter or by email or in Slack rooms, and then getting together face-to-face over video conferencing. So what we're actually doing is even digitally transforming, for lack of a better buzzword, our whole idea of relationships. So we don't need to be face-to-face to sustain our relationships anymore. If you take the time to think about what you're doing and the contacts you're having, and to spend time, you know, you and I occasionally spend time just talking about stuff, right? Which is exactly the same as being face-to-face at a conference. And so it's about thinking about what you're doing and changing your habits. Your habits are, I know how to talk face-to-face because I've learned it all my life. If I'm now going to learn how to face-to-face over Zoom or some intermediary, I just have to re-habituate myself.
Conference goers have to change. Like, this isn't, if you're used to going to in-person conference, if you're like us and you can't even count the number of conferences that you've gone to, there's habits you have to change. One of which is kind of this networking thing. You know, we could always go to the bloggers lounge or the press and media session or the hangout space to find each other. For my virtual conference, I had a lounge, and that lounge had a link to a Zoom. And if you wanted to just spend the whole conference hanging out and not going to any sessions, you could do that. You could just go to the Zoom, and there was 20 people just sitting there hanging out, and you meet new people and you see good old friends. So what other habits do you think conference goers have to change, traditional in-person conference goers have to change to consume virtual conferences? And how does the conferences have to change to adapt?
So there's two things. One is, if you're in the room, it's really easy to focus your attention on what's happening. You could watch the stage, you can see the speaker. There's a personal immediacy to that. So even if you're only giving someone 50% of your attention because they're not a very good speaker, or they're not very interesting, or the content's a bit tedious, you know, like when a vendor engineer stands up and just goes into the spiel, and you can hear it, right? You can hear the blah, 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 blah.
You can hear the automation. Like, this is practice. This is not his first rodeo, giving this a very, very same topic.
Yeah. And you know, this person's just turned up, pulled out the standard deck, and they've pressed play, right? Well, so you can't replace that. So if you're going to have a virtual conference and you're taking away the smell and the travel and the stimulation of being there in person, you have to amp up your content. Your content has to be so interesting that my email doesn't take me away from your event. Your speaker has to be so good that I'm not inclined to open up Twitter over here and check to see if anybody's slagging him off in the background, you know, or go into Slack to say, this guy is a banana job. You know, this guy has no idea what he's talking, you know, whatever it is, right? Your content has to be blisteringly good. It has to be visually rich. Your speaker has to be good audio. Like some of the conferences we saw recently, our virtual events I've been on, the audio has been appalling. Like people turning up and, you know, it's like, hi, I'm great. You know, I'm here to talk about, you know, and you're like, I can't hear you, you know, and he's just like yelling at a laptop on the other side of the room, you know, and it's just, they don't take time to do what you and I have done, a little bit investment in a camera, a little bit of investment in an audio system to make it so, because if I can't, you know, when you go to a physical event, we spend tens of thousands of dollars for every room to make that audio absolutely perfect, right? Audio microphones, the rooms are built for perfect audio, all that sort of stuff. And yet on a virtual conference, people expect to pick up their crappy mobile phone and a $10 microphone, maybe, you know, if you're very lucky, they're using Apple AirPods, which is still bad audio, by the way, right? And
but
they're
way
not
better than laptop audio. That's 5
you know,
feet away.
Yeah, your laptop microphone is like just a tick box on the tender, right? It's got to have a microphone. Well, let's put in a 5-cent microphone and away you go, right? And so I just think people haven't made the transition and thought about, you know, if I spend $500,000 hiring a hall to do a presentation in, all that audio work was done for me and they didn't even know. You know, people don't think about how much is done for you. But if you're doing a virtual event, you have to get people investing in decent microphones, good lighting. Like you and I have got the same thing. You've got some good lighting in the room. I've got lights all around me shining on me. Not expensive lights, by the way, just, you know, $100 worth of lights and adjustable colors and little tiny things that require just a little bit of preparation and effort. And that's something that used to be done for you at a physical event that you now are responsible for. So there's a flip here, right? Good content and basic hygiene around the mechanics of the video conference.
So talking about debugging the event, I want to spend at least a minute talking about that very topic. It was, if you've ever been to a conference, you've put on a couple of conferences, virtual conferences, and whether it's virtual or whatever, getting the content in is extremely, extremely difficult. Even when you're paying for our independent speakers, so people who weren't working for vendors, we paid them an honorarium. Not a lot of money, but hey, you know what? I'm making a couple of dollars off this conference, so therefore I'm not going to insult you.
If I'm making money, you should make money too.
You should.
If I'm not making money, yeah.
So, but even with that, creating content is, for us who create content nearly daily, is still extremely difficult. So for someone who's not accustomed to creating content, we went over and board. We hired a AV person. We offered them out. We said, hey, you know what? They will come on, do a Zoom video with you, and we'll magically produce your slides, et cetera, et cetera. Barely no one took us up on it. And we ended up getting the content the weekend before the event. The event was on a Tuesday. We got most of the content in on that Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And I hired Jeff Powles of Geekazine to actually produce the content. So that file that they gave us, that local file that they gave us, we went in and then we put an additional investment in to make sure that the audio was acceptable, to make sure that the picture was consistent, and that, you know, I hired a person who just took every headshot and made sure that every headshot looked similar to each other so they had the same theme.
Yeah.
These are details you have to take care of to have a virtual event so that people don't, you know, I pulled weeds out of the garden the other day, and no one ever notices that there's no weeds in the garden. But everyone notices if you have weeds in the garden. And a virtual event is the exact same thing. No one notices that the sound is great until you have bad sound.
And I can back that up with analytics. So on our podcasts, when we have a sponsored podcast where a client comes, a vendor comes and sponsors a show and we talk, and the vendor, despite all of our preparation and encouragement and, you know, decent, they turn up with bad audio. what we see is that there's a chart that shows the engagement through a podcast, right? That you get from Apple's analytics. And for most of our podcasts, 60 to 70% of our audience is listening at 60 to 70% of the way through the show. Now that's phenomenally high engagement, right?
That's very high, yes.
Right. If you've got bad audio and a sponsored podcast with a bad speaker, it's 30-30. Only 30% of your audience is still listening 1/3 of the way through.
So,
because if you've just got bad, it doesn't matter what the person's talking about, it'll go 50-50. People will go at the halfway point, only half is left. But if you've got bad content and bad audio, it's 1/3 of the audience is listening 1/3 of the way through. That's how bad it ramps off.
So let's say that there is a good virtual event and you're consuming the virtual event. As a virtual event consumer, is your expectation to spend the whole day at the virtual event? Like when you're looking at the agenda, are you saying, you know what, I'm going to lock myself in for the whole day for this? Well, in the case of IBM Think last week, it was 3 days, the whole 3 days of the virtual event.
I think that's unrealistic. I think the reason we used to do full day events in person was because you have to. Once you've shifted yourself from wherever you are to being there, you want the event to be running for 10 to 12 hours a day because you've got nothing else to do but sit in a hotel room anyway, right? Or maybe if you're lucky, have a nice meal and something at the bar if the company's covering your expenses. So is it realistic to expect people to give up an entire day? If you've got the ability to not do an entire day, then that's what you should do because now you need to adapt to the medium. So the question is not whether you should do days of content. That's absolutely a fundamental flaw. You've just said, I'm just going to repeat what I used to do in person and forget that I'm now in the digital world, that I'm on internet time, and I'm not going to change. I'm just going to do it again, right? I'm going to take it. That is completely wrong in my view. The way that you should be doing it is thinking, I should be running tracks and I should be running them 52 weeks a year. So I should be doing it for 2 hours a day because I can get 2 hours a day of someone's attention because the rest of the day he's got a real job or she's going to be in meetings or they're going to be away with their family. So the idea that you're going to promote an event and build it up to 8 hours of content. And this is what we found with our shows. We tried, our first one was 4 hours. Our second one was 3 hours. Our third one was 2 hours. And even at that, we were still struggling to maintain attention and engagement. And the mistake that we did was actually turn it into an event. I think ultimately it's got to be a podcast, something that happens every week. So instead of having an event jammed in the middle, it's got to be something that just happens all the time.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Some stats from out of my event, I had about 640 registrations. Peak login, I think we had 280 people actually log into the event. And just from a practical, the way that I tracked the attendance throughout the day was the number of people in chat. So I started out the peak during the keynote, 140, 150 people in chat. That stayed pretty consistent for the first 2 hours of the event. The fourth and fifth hour, and the event was a 5-hour event. The fourth and fifth hour, it completely fell off the cliff, 60, 70 people. And I don't know how many of those people were actually, well, I do know how many people are engaged because I can go look at the tracks and the sessions and see how many people attended the sessions. But definitely the sweet spot for this type of event that I put on, and I'm about 85% sure that the next time I put on an event is not going to be this format. In my mind, it was a success, but it wasn't a sustainable way to put on a branded event. I absolutely agree with you that it should not be, you have the capability for it to be a weekly thing, and you have the capability for it to be a one to, maybe 3 or 4 micro 15-minute sessions a week, and that Zoom engagement before and after, so that you're getting the social mix of it. I think that's the format that I'm going to go for next. The challenge, and both me and you have this, is paying for this. Like, you know, this is not our time, our speakers' time, the platforms, all these things cost money. And that model, and I wanted to end the conversation kind of like, how do you pay for it? Even if I treated it, I have this wild idea that I'm going to treat this as just overhead for my business, as opposed to going out and getting straight out sponsors. That changes like the end user experience, the richness of the experience.
It does,
but you trade off that without not having to have to trade your information to attend one of my events. What's your thoughts on the financial side of this?
So the financial side is really, really difficult. And I think what we'll see is the cycle of, let's take the physical event, turn it into a digital event and see who turns up, right? And they're going to be disappointed because a lot of people will have other things on. They won't be available because they're not putting their lives on hold and sitting down for the 3 days of virtual events. And because the content, so there are some vendors who do brilliant jobs of producing amazing content. Cisco and VMware are the two that come to my mind. If you sit in their sessions, they are outstanding. And both companies then record it and then publish it into a library. So you can then go and see those sessions. And the content is almost universally, especially the technology content. I mean, the keynotes that these people produce have been going downhill for years. They're almost unwatchable these days, right? Once upon a time, a keynote was a way to celebrate and to be, feel whatever. Now it's mostly like the CEO gets up and goes, "God, it's so great. I'm here to talk to you. And hang on for a sec. We're going to get someone on the stage." And somebody comes on the stage. "This guy is the CEO of company X." And he stands up on stage and reads the legally binding text of, "Our company has cars with wheels on the side. They are very good cars. And we use company X's products." And it's just this show of people congratulating each other on how clever they are about being on charge and getting on stage. The keynotes aren't the celebration, or they don't resonate with me like they did 5 years ago, when it was much more of a genuine user group feel. Like, this is what we did. This went great. Much more. The keynotes have turned into a cross between financial analyst messaging, bragging, slagging off your competitors indirectly, and then getting customers to come up on stage in the idea that it would actually be fresh and invigorating. And in fact, they're just tedious and dull. And so really, I think we actually have to find a way to generate a new form of content that is engaging and worthwhile. And that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing people transplant the legacy event straight into the virtual event, and then finding that it's, crashing up against irrelevance, because what you're presenting works when someone's in the room, but doesn't work when they've got other distractions around them and other things that might be impinging on their attention. And the chances of you grabbing those people's attention for 2 hours is, yes, you can do that. 4 hours, you want to have something amazing to hold on to an audience for 4 hours, but you're not going to publish 3 times 8 or 3 times 10 hours and get people sitting there for 3 days going through it. And indeed, what's the value of that? Even if they did, what am I getting for that 3 days? Like, people don't even spend, if you think about it, there are people out there who built entire careers on training courses of 5 days of training, right? So there's not, everything we're talking about here applies equally to the educational process. If you think about people doing micro certifications for any of the vendors, they used to fly to a place and sit in a room and have, a curriculum thrown at them. People aren't going to do that after COVID. That curriculum is going to have to be delivered online in some way, because people are going to refuse to get on a plane. I'm thinking particularly of VMware's micro certification program, where if you want to be a certified administrator or a certified professional in the VMware products, you're forced to go and sit in a room for somebody to deliver you a standard curriculum. That's not going to happen for another year.
Yeah, I'm super excited to see how innovation happens after this. There's a lot of things that we didn't touch on. One was platform. I'm just not impressed with the virtual platforms and the options available to make a rich experience. Right after people, I had a couple of people who say, like, some of the feedback that we ran from the show was outstanding. I had one guy who said, "Keith, this felt like a VM world." No, that blew me away. I'm like, okay, that's great,
I'm there
but
for that. That's pretty
the
cool.
you've put on content, you've created video. I've seen the types of videos that you create, and you're very particular about the lighting, the sound, etc. So there's an experience you want your customers to have.
Yeah.
And while I was appreciative that I was able to put on the virtual event, it still wasn't the experience that I had in mind and that I want my customers to have. And that's 100% the platform. And it's given me pause to put on another virtual event.
It is going to be hard. And I think one last comment before we run away. Don't forget that we, as members of the audience, have a responsibility to change ourselves, right? Because when you go to a conference and sit in the room, you choose. Very easy to pay attention, very easy to listen. If you're sitting at home and, or at the office and you're joining into a virtual event, you have to retrain yourself to pay attention to the screen, to listen to the speakers, to not go to your email, to not to invoke the daily habits of sitting there and thinking about, I've got to write this report, I've got to do this, I've got emails, turn off all your notifications, stop them from binging and bonging while you're watching because if you're not making a point of sitting there and consuming that content, you might as well have not turned up at all. And so we have a responsibility. One of the ways I'm doing it is when I'm watching a virtual event, I write notes as I go. And at the end of it, I tear the page out and throw it in the bin, but because, it's just, but it helps me.
Yeah.
So this is how I'm retraining myself to focus on. I did the same thing just to highlight that this isn't new. This is the same. When I went to school, I was taught to read from a book, right? I had to take a book and I learned to read left to right and down the bottom. And, and when 10 years ago, when I started reading from a computer screen, when screens got good enough to read from, when they got to retina class sort of stuff, I had to relearn and teach my brain how to read from a screen. So now I find it very difficult to read a physical book because I read everything as an ebook or a PDF or some other.
I find it super difficult because the ebook you can swipe up, swipe right, and it's just much easier to read to find the content that you really want versus a book. If I'm on vacation and I just want to fall asleep at the beach, I'll bust out a physical book and get through about 2 or 3 pages and fall asleep. So, virtual events.
But keep in mind, you went to school for 20 years to learn how to read and write. Like the first thing they teach you at school is how to sit down and shut up. And the second thing they do is teach you how to read from a book, like read from a page. And now you're telling me that suddenly you've got to read from a screen. That is a different experience. You need to be consciously adapting your thinking and taking time to say, okay, I'm struggling to read from the screen, but this is the new way. All right. And so the same applies to a virtual event. You as a consumer need to don't sit there and say, I'm in the lecture theater listening to this, you've got to adapt yourself to it. And remember, at the front half of the show, of course, we were saying the speakers have to adapt to the medium, but then so does the audience.
And so does the audience. So speaking of audience, for those who weren't watching this as a video presentation, because easily see the lower thirds of where to find you on Twitter and how to find the Packet Pushers. How do they find you and how do they find the Packet Pushers?
You can find me at the Packet Pushers, which is packetpushers.net. We've been doing a podcast. We're in our 10th year. We just finished our 10th anniversary. So we started in May 2010. It's now May 2020. We've been podcasting now for 10 glorious years, I guess is the way to talk about it. And you can find us on Twitter as @PacketPushers. And I'm personally, you can find my personal Twitter account as @EtherealMind, where I tweet quite regularly throughout the day and often quite, shall we say, provocatively and engaging.
So I listened to that 10th episode, and as a excerpt, you guys mentioned how people have followed, you follow certain listeners' careers and how they rise through the ranks. Funny, at my last job, and this is me fully knowing you and having beers with you and you and my wife flipping each other off in a bar in London. One of the senior network managers at my last full-time employee job was like, "Oh yeah, Keith, the Greg Ferro fanboy." I'm like, Greg will get a kick out of that. It was hilarious. I've never shared that story with you, but I've mentioned the content from the Packet Pushers so much throughout my career and the work that you guys do that I thought that was just a validation, a data point for the point that you guys made on that 10th anniversary show. You can find me on the web. The website is thectoadvisor.com. And maybe when this publishes, CTO Advisor Data Center, what we're doing with the hybrid infrastructure sponsored by ? Will be up and running. Talk to you next CTO Advisor podcast, CTO Dose video.